So we turn to social justice and the thought of Mordechai M. Caplan, a conversation with Rabbis David Saperstein, Jill Jacobs, and Shmuly Yanklowitz. And I have to say, I don't usually get schmaltzy, but these are three of my personal heroes, so it's absolutely wonderful to have this. Eric, you will become my personal hero when you complete the text-searchable edition of Caplan's Diaries in about 20 years, so just so you know.
Hi. So, the way this session is going to work is a little bit different than originally anticipated because of the fact that two of the presenters, Rabbis Jill Jacobs and Shmuly Yanklowitz, could not be here because of our wonderful weather, and they're coming in via Skype. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce to those of you who don't know Rabbi David Saperstein, who is on stage here with us, the benefits of living in Washington. And
no excuse to Skype.
And I just want to kind of warn you that it is possible, even though we're working really hard. I should say Sean is working very hard to make sure that this connection works well and it is smooth and will look kind of like a breaking news story on CNN. It is possible that there will be dropouts of voice in different parts, and I hope that you will be patient with that, because the way this session is constructed is just to give you some background. About a month and a half ago, I sent to the three rabbis who are on this panel selections from Caplan having to do with his social justice thinking. And I asked them to take a look at them. They were familiar with them, obviously, but hadn't looked at them for a while. And then we had a very nice conversation to map out how we're going to run this session. So the session is going to be basically in more of kind of an interview format, in which I'm going to be asking different questions based on the writings of Mordechai Caplan to help you guys out in the audience follow what it is that we're doing. I've created this PowerPoint here, which has many of the core texts that we're going to be talking about in it, but not everything. It wasn't possible to put them all here without clicking every 2 seconds in a way that is not very helpful and not very useful to you. So to introduce the panel, I want to say that, there's been a number of wonderful Caplan conferences over the years. I have had the pleasure of attending one of them, but there hasn't been a session like this one on Caplan and social justice. And I think it's because we don't normally associate Caplan with social justice in this way. And as I've kind of reflected upon it, as I've been thinking about it over the years, I think it has to do with the fact that, and if anybody who's here wants to chime in on this point, I think that we generally associate social activism with somebody who's out there physically doing the social justice work. And Caplan wasn't doing that in the traditional sense. And as a result of that, when we think of great Jewish social justice figures of our time, we think of such as the people who are on today's panel, who are very clearly not only writing about social justice, but engaged in it in a very clear activist way. And of course, that iconic photo of Heschel marching with Martin Luther King is something helps us clearly associate Heschel with social justice, as well as his work on with clergy against the Vietnam War. Caplan's is a major social justice thinker. In other words, his thought, I think, is a very, very rich consideration of the social justice imperative, but we can't say that he's an activist in the traditional sense. His writing is kind of a foundation and a call for activism. And before I throw out my first question to panelists, I just wanted to share with you this quote here, which you could read. I don't want to read all of the quotes that are coming out here, but what is unique here is that as somebody who works in Jewish education, I'm a professor of Jewish education, what Caplan is saying here is that all of the things that we normally associate as the primary purposes of Jewish education in the field are actually the subordinate purposes of Jewish education. Because what is the primary purpose of Jewish education? It is, as it says here, is to qualify the Jew for such participation in the life of both the Jewish and the general community as will make for a better world. Jewish education that fails to extend the young Jew's spiritual perspective and to link his personal life with the life of mankind is wasted effort. Not just bad, but wasted effort, right? And this is just one quote that I have on my computer that shows the centrality of social justice to his thinking, but it's all over his thinking. So let us get into to the quotes that are the foundation here, and I want to welcome Jill and Shmuly, who I can now see you up here on the screen, and I really appreciate that you've been able to join us in this hookup and can join our conversation. So one of the interesting things about Caplan's approach to social justice is I think he has a very strong sense that the place for Jews to begin their social justice work is within their own communities and making them the most ethical that they can be, right? So as he says in this quote that I've put up here, that yes, we have to participate in the global struggles against poverty, etc. But as he says here, to qualify for participation in this struggle, Jewry must set its own house in order, right? The Jewish community is not free from the evils that beset society in general and must accept full responsibility for carrying out the fight against them on its own sector of humanity's front. So he talks about it both as a community. I thought this quote was an interesting one. Lavish gifts for communal purposes must not be regarded as justifying the appointment of the donors to positions of importance unless they are morally, intellectually, and Jewishly qualified for them. And as individuals, here he talks about truth, and he says that Jews sometimes individually do not live by the highest standards of truth, and doing so should be a goal for the Jewish community. And he writes here that if the Jewish community actually did so, a person would be ashamed to appear in a Jewish assembly and certainly would not dream of seeking office in any Jewish institution if he was guilty of a breach of contract or of repudiation of a sacred pledge. So the first question I want to throw out is whether you share Caplan's sense that for Jews, social justice, ethical living must first start internally within the community, and only if we strive to do that can we talk in the public space with an authoritative voice. And perhaps I'll ask Jill to start us off.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm so sorry that I couldn't be there in person, and I'm very impressed that you all managed to get from wherever you are to the conference. And I want to really, Eric, I want to thank you for putting together this panel, because when I was at JTS, I got to read a lot of Caplan, but we always read him for theology and for halakha. And I actually never read him for social justice, and it was very helpful to see these excerpts pulled out in order to create a social justice narrative about who he was. So I very much appreciated that. So I absolutely agree with Caplan's assertion that we need to get our house in order. The place where I get anxious is this idea that we need to get our house in order before we go out and advocate in the greater world, because we've been trying to get our house in order for, I don't know, 2,000 years, and we're still working on it. That's something that's very deep in the halachic system, that there's many, many halachot, of course, about interpersonal relationships, about civil law. It's key to our ethical systems, our ethical values. And I do believe that we have been trying to get this right for a couple of thousand years. One of the things that struck me, actually, when I read the Pew study that came out a few months ago, was that some majority of Jews say that part of being Jewish is to lead an ethical life. Another majority say that it also involves engagement in the world. And I think those two things have to happen at the same time. Of course, it would be hypocritical to say, well, we're going to get involved in the bigger world. We're going to work for living wage. We're going to work for better benefits for people. We're going to work for all of these things, and we're going to let our own institutions not exemplify that. And at the same time, I think that if we just look at and say, you know what, we're just going to work on having good institutions, good relationships internally, then we're going to miss our chance maybe for a couple of thousands of years to engage in the bigger world. And I think that the last thing I'll say is that this point about Jewish education is really key, that he doesn't say, looking for the exact quote, that it's to qualify the Jew for participation in the life of both the Jewish and the general community, as it will make for a better world. So there, I don't see him saying you have to choose between one or the other. I see him trying to balance the universal and particularist, saying that the Jew who's had a good Jewish education, the point of Judaism is that we do have some particulars. We have these communities. We have a primary relationship with our own community and obligations to our own community. And all of that is the basis as well for pushing us out into the bigger world.
Thank you. David, I think I'll go to you first before going to Shmuly. Just to perhaps add to that, do you find when you're going out and doing the wonderful activism that the RAC does, that you get pushback, let's say, from people who say, well, how about in your community, blah, blah, blah?
Yeah, first, it's a delight to be with Julie and Shmuel. They are really stars of this generation of the Jewish community when it comes to social justice work, and I'm really honored to be with them and pleased to be with all of you here. And Eric, I thank you for all your really good work. And Dan, you've been a friend for a long time, and I deeply appreciate it. This is, I think, for Caplan, this can't be either or, because for Caplan, the institution is the indispensable means of getting to the broader world. Whether he's right or wrong, I think the sense of it is that a Judaism without Torah, without Gimilut Chasadim, to go with Torah and Avodah, is not authentic Judaism, since this idea of the ethical is really the commanding presence. More obviously than the divine, it is the commanding presence. He stands in that sense with Hermann Cohen in terms of accepting the idea of a categorical imperative that requires us to ethics. On the other hand, you cannot have the ethics of Gimilut Chasadim or speaking to the broader world without having Torah and Avodah. In other words, he sees that that is actually the role, the raison d'etre of Torah study. It isn't because God commanded it, it's because it's the indispensable means of creating a person of conscience. And it is, and worship and ritual plays that indispensable means of helping people to lift up their ethical consciousness. And for him, these are indispensable, that we have to do it. I think I stand with Jill and Shmuly in saying, but there's also another reason for doing that, which is this kind of sense of hypocrisy here. It is not enough for us to be a prophet to the outside world. Jews do that great. Jews, whether they're conservatives or liberals, Jews are involved so disproportionately in every cause of social justice in America. Whether we're dealing with their role as staff, as public intellectuals, as board members, as donors, way out of proportion to our numbers in society across the political spectrum. For most Jews, the polls show this is the way they're doing their Jewishness, expressing their Jewish identity. But we're often much weaker about our own institutions. We talk about accessibility for the differently abled. We're not so good in our own congregations in really taking people who face mental or physical disabilities and making a place for them in our congregation. The question of a living wage is fine when the Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, and Reconstructionist movements are talking about it in society, but how many of us actually have living wages in our congregations for all of the employees? How many of us have paid sick leave? How many of us have things that we are exempt from? This is the same debate going over religious exemptions in other arenas today. How many of us really take seriously the things we don't have to do by law in making them real in our own congregations? We have a long way to go, and I think Caplan saw that quite clearly 80 years ago, and it speaks as powerfully to us today as a moral conscience to ourselves than as it did back then.
Thank you. Shmuly, could I, before you speak, could I just throw out two things to you, maybe to add to your comments? Is one, I'm curious how Caplan's quote here about getting our house in order relates to the work that, the wonderful work that Uri L'Tzedek is doing on Tava Yosher. And secondly, if you had to, as David just did, think of some things that the Jewish community perhaps you would like to see it doing a better job in internally, what might they be?
Thank you. Well, I feel very excited and grateful to be a part of this conversation. I'm glad we can make it work by Skype. And Rabbi Saperstein and Rabbi Jacobs are two of my heroes, just enormously remarkable thinkers and activists. It's always great to join them for learning. And Dan and Eric, it's your intellectual energy is contagious since we started this conversation. So I'm thrilled to be a part of this. I'd also share that Caplan is not taught in the Orthodox yeshivot. And so it was really with a book underneath my stender that I would kind of access this. And so I feel very grateful to be able to return to this wisdom in an open conversation. You know, it's interesting being in Scottsdale, Arizona today, where it's 75 degrees and sunny, and not being able to fly to DC in the snowstorm reminds me that we're a part of a conversation, and yet the same conversation, and yet existing in a radically different culture and climate. And I think that's, in some vague sense, what Caplan might have felt as well, the sense that he's in the same conversation with some shared language, and yet they're really situated in radically different cultures and value systems. And I've been very intrigued in trying to access the different underpinnings of the epistemic foundations that are being operated with here. Eric, to go to your first point here, this first quote about revolutionizing the educational system, you know, I think as, you know, in the Orthodox community, in many ways, I have the biggest communal and pedagogical challenge with this. In many ways, mitzvot are seen as ends in themselves. Torah, the notion of Torah lishma. I mean, I'm personally a student of the Ta'amei HaMitzvot, that things are done for a reason, and that mitzvot are a vehicle towards a higher end. But I think I find myself in many ways in a minority in my community. And I think there's been this turn towards peoplehood and survival, which has become like an egel zahav, a golden calf, an idolatrous worship that I think Caplan is protesting against here. The notion that we can't just survive, but we need to thrive for some higher purpose. And that if our education is just furthering our texts and our history and our languages and our literature and our sense of self-pride, then we've actually wasted those profoundly. And so I'm very inspired by that notion, that our education system actually needs to mobilize us towards a higher purpose of collaboration and cohesion towards higher and more noble goals. I think we have a long way to go to get there. To this point about cleaning up our own shops, this message speaks to me profoundly. It's a lot easier to go away. I've been a part of a lot of service learning projects in developing countries, and students are very willing to engage in problems overseas in ways they might not be willing to at home. And you are correct, Eric, that I've kind of borne the brunt of or experienced some of the pain of what it means to try to clean up your own shops. One example, when we launched the international boycott against agri-processors, against the Rabushkin meat factory that was producing 60% of the kosher beef, 40% of the kosher chicken, we felt an enormous backlash of this is almost like anti-Semitic to be challenging your own people publicly. And so when I do my work of ethical kashrut or of worker justice or of domestic violence, I feel this fear that resurfaces of, oh my goodness, we're going to be found, we're going to be caught, we're going to lose our power and privilege in society if we attempt to call each other out. And of course, there's non-confrontational and less public ways to do this, but we know that shame is unfortunately the most powerful vehicle in the Jewish community. The other point I would just make about this, about starting at home, is that I think one of the core principles of community organizing is that you want to build a power base. And your power base is always stronger, I think, when you're addressing something on the home front that's relevant and you have your own power base in your own community, as opposed to going outside. I don't know if Caplan had that particular point in mind strategically, but on the moral front itself, Rabbi Jacobs and I last week at a Wexner conference, we're studying this interesting Talmudic passage of being toivel im sheretz b'yado, going into a mikvah while still holding something impure, that you can't actually purify yourself while you're holding on to impurity yourself. And I think in some sense, when we're trying to build a Jewish social justice movement while still being embedded in our own systems of inequality and injustice, we've done a disservice outside of ourselves as well as inside.
Thank you. Jill, do you want to add something before we move on to the next issue?
I think we can move on to the next issue.
Okay. So now that we've kind of established the centrality of social justice to his thought and spoke about one core principle, what I want to do is to take a look at how Caplan relates to four aspects of the Jewish tradition and uses them as resources, vehicles for helping Jews develop themselves ethically and therefore become, and the community to become a better vehicle for social justice. And the four things that I'm hoping that we'll get to, time permitted, is our text study, ritual, prayer, and faith. The role of God in the life of the social activist. So the first thing is to do with Torah. I'm trying to remember all the things that I have to do here. So I want to put up this quote here for you to take a look at. Here is a quote where Caplan talks about how we can approach Torah, and it should not be surprising to you that he feels that while Torah can give guidance on certain things, on other things it cannot give guidance because its point of view is one that he doesn't think a modern can hold, or whether because he feels that the Torah just logically wouldn't have thought of it because it's just something that's so different than the world from which the Torah came. But regardless of even those passages of Torah that are ones that an individual cannot agree with, he believes are of relevance to the social justice thinker, because sometimes, just like when I have my students going out in the field and doing student teaching, I find the students come back to me and they say, as many times, I saw this wonderful teacher and I want to be exactly like them. there will also be, I just saw one of the worst classes that I've ever seen, and I want to make sure that I don't do anything similar to that. So that dynamic, obviously, the Bible is never on that same level, but that same dynamic of being able to learn both from things which one sees as positive and as things that one sees as negative in one sense, are both embedded in what Caplan says here. But he adds some ideas here. That I want to put out there before we open it up. I open up for conversation. The one is, he says later on in The Future of the American Jew, and I didn't put this quote up for you, which he says, the canvassing of all social, political, and economic problems for the purpose of habituating ourselves to act in the interest of a better future for the world should formally and actively be accepted as Torah study for our day. So in other words, in addition to studying Torah, literally the Torah, he believes that important ethical texts, legal texts that are both within the Jewish tradition and outside of the tradition, but most significantly here, I think, outside the Jewish tradition, can be viewed as Torah, because fundamentally for him, we've talked about his functionalist approach, fundamentally for him, anything that helps us to live a better life is Torah in a broader broader sense. And the study, however, has to be done in the right way. Right? In other words, if you just study, he says here, the Exodus, and you learn all the storylines or whatever, but you don't extrapolate from it its religious message, Caplan says that is not religious education, because it doesn't help you live a more meaningful life necessarily. But if, on the other hand, the secular writings of Pinsker, Ahad Ha'am, or Brandeis are taught with a view of inspiring the student to participate in the self-emancipation of the Jewish people and of all peoples that are the victims of discrimination and oppression, they become matter for Jewish religious education. So the issues which I want to put on the table for us to think about as a group is, one is, what is your response to how Caplan views the Torah, capitalized? What is the role of the Torah in your own activism? How does it function in your own activism? What is your response to the idea of broadening what Jews study and call Torah, and including in it perhaps non-Jewish texts? And any thoughts that you might have on the way we need to study text in order to really ensure that they are inspiring of social justice. So I gave, I think Jill started first last time, so we'll start with Shmuly first on this one.
Great. All right, it's a fascinating issue here. I remember living in Israel when I had a faith crisis some 10 years ago in Talmud Torah, in the enterprise of full-time Torah study. In my teens and early and mid-20s, I had believed that Torah study just works, right? You go into a room all day and you study, and you're going to come out a more spiritually and ethically transformed being from having encountered this rich tradition. And it kind of shook because I began to encounter individuals who I did not believe were the pinnacle of ethical and spiritual longing and actualization, who were engaged in Torah study. And I started to realize, as Caplan just articulated, that actually Torah doesn't magically work. That if you don't study Torah in the proper way, it can actually have an inverse or a perversive effect on one's conscience, even to silence one's conscience in many ways. And so I very much embrace that we need to be more thoughtful about our educational process in terms of making sure that the values we cherish in our tradition actually not only penetrate, but are cultivated in the right way. I also agree that Torah study can be found in everything. I guess it's a little bit of my Hasidic side, that an encounter with human beings, and also, in what Buber extended to the I-thou encounter as sort of a spiritual encounter, I experience intellectually as well that an encounter with anything in the world can be a form of sort of a hermeneutical process of inquiry and discovery. And I would say, though, that I think that the tradition needs to kind of been absorbed in order to be a lens to encounter that first. I think if one doesn't have any sort of formal education in the text, then an encounter with the world it's hard for me to call that Torah. Whereas if one has sort of an initial lens and framework to use, I think the whole world can become sort of a Beit Midrash, a study house. You know, and I find Kaplan's notion of honest critique to be refreshing of the tradition. But I also find myself disappointed that he viewed, at least in some of these passages, scripts as biblical, whereas I view myself as a Talmudic Jew, that the living tradition has evolved, and that there's a very living conversation around Torah and halakha, using a Jewish language that's thousands of years old to continue to make meaning of our current situation. And I don't find it to be lacking. I find it to be lacking if one views it as closed, but if it's a part of an evolving conversation, I find it to be quite rich. The last thing I'll say on this point is that the starting place for me in this encounter with text is the notion of tzivui, the notion of obligation and commandedness. Now, I see in Kaplan's thinking, he also embraces a notion of commandedness. We're commanded by our shared history, by our collectivity, by a covenant that comes from our collective experiences. And I am a pluralist in that I believe that obligation can come from very different places. Whether I view it as a place of revelation from the divine, and if Kaplan views it as from this historical place, I find that to be a rich conversation. But for me, it's more than inspiration from text. I find myself compelled and even obligated by the text as sort of the foundation of my social justice work, that the text and God cries out to me from one angle, and the cry of the vulnerable from another place, and they kind of meet in my own, I hate to use sort of ontological type language, but in my own neshama, in my own soul, I feel the clash of the language of the sages with the clash of the language of the crying vulnerable in our own time. And both of those sort of encounter each other in kind of a rich and complicated and oftentimes painful way.
Thank you. Jill?
Sure. I was thinking as I was preparing for the panel that it was so great I was waiting to use this line about an Orthodox, a conservative, and a Reform rabbi walk into a panel on Caplan. And I think it very much comes out in this question of obligation. This is, of course, one of his innovations is to say that the source of obligation lies with the community, as opposed to saying, as a reform movement does, David, you can argue or not about this, that the source of obligation lies with the individual and individual informed choice, or in the Orthodox and conservative movements who accept halakha as in some way divinely mandated, located in Torah and tradition. All of those terms obviously can use a lot more explanation. So I found myself very much struggling with this passage, with these passages that you gave us, for a couple of reasons. First of all, I felt like on the one hand, he's saying something very radical, and on the other hand, he's saying something that's deeply conservative. So what's deeply conservative about this, maybe I'll start with what's radical. So he's making this argument that the way that we've studied the Torah in the past is, he doesn't exactly use the word old-fashioned, but that there was this approach of saying that the Torah dictates how we behave. That doesn't make sense anymore. We now need to expand the notion of Torah in order to include what we've learned from the world around us. And so he presents that as this dichotomy. Either we're blindly following the Torah, or we're more expansively also incorporating, whether it's modern philosophers, whether it's personal experiences, whether it's the wisdom of people in our own community, as well as our history. But I think that's actually a deeply conservative with a small c, meaning it's very much inherent in Judaism. So if I think about, very classically, hapoch bava kolba, right? You turn in, and everything's there. And that, for me, that very much is how I approach Torah study and how I approach Torah and social justice. That I very much believe that social justice is deeply rooted in the Torah, and I'm going to use it without the modifier, without the, that Torah for me encompasses the Torah, those 5 books. It encompasses rabbinic tradition. It encompasses Jewish history. It encompasses the experiences of Jews. It encompasses all of our various books that we've written, commentaries, etc., that we've written through the ages. And in those, I find the attempts to create a coherent system of how we're supposed to live our lives. And so in that coherent system are things like what I'm supposed to eat for breakfast or what I'm not supposed to eat for breakfast. But also in that coherent system are how I'm supposed to treat my kids and my family and my friends and my coworkers, as well as how I'm supposed to act toward people who I'm employing. So everything for me is in that coherent system, and it's not about saying, well, there's religious stuff over here and there's civil law over there, and those two things don't come together, or there's human experience over here and religious ritual stuff over there. For me, it's all part of the whole. And I think that he's, on the one hand, unnecessarily divorcing those two, and on the other hand, referring to very traditional ideas. So, for example, I think about how the rabbis of the Talmud were perfectly happy to argue with, challenge, sometimes completely uproot a Torah law that didn't make sense in their world. Of course, the most famous one is the Ben Sora Amora, the rebellious child, where the rabbis are able to, that was the child who's supposed to be stoned, and the rabbis are able to essentially legislate that out of existence. Now, that doesn't mean that they say, let's take a black marker and just mark up the Torah and get rid of it. They also don't say, oh, well, I guess if our kids misbehave in some really egregious way, we need to go out and stone them. They're able to say, this is a really challenging text, and let's argue with it and debate it and figure out how we can keep it in the Torah, not try to excise it, and not get ourselves into a situation where we're actually stoning our children. So that's just one example, and there's many, many more. So in my own work, I think about having real arguments with the text and allowing them to challenge me, and often to bring perspectives that I wouldn't have thought of. So the other thing that, and I think that's what it means to have a real engagement with Jewish text, to say, yes, we're obligated by this text because of, and then fill in the blank, whether it's because of God, whether it's because of community, whether it's because of tradition, fill in the blank with wherever the source of obligation is for us, but then say, and we can't just go through and pick out what we like, we need to struggle with all of it. Now, in some cases, that might be saying, you know what, this is really not workable anymore, and we need to figure out how to challenge it. I think about all of the various Mishnayot that deal with the idea of Mipnei Tikkun HaOlam, the places where the rabbis, or mostly Rabban Gamliel, were able to come in and say, here's a situation where we have this law that is not working, it's threatening to undermine our society because it's going to end up with maybe women who aren't sure whether they're divorced or not. Or maybe it's going to end up with a situation where, in one text, where we might not have anyone who wants to be a doctor because the consequences of making a mistake are too great. And he's able to go in and say, well, Mipnei Tikkun HaOlam, I'm going to change this law. Not I'm going to throw out the whole system, but I'm going to change this law. And I very much think that that's how we engage, that we should engage with text, that we take it seriously and we argue with it and think that it's constantly moving. Now, in his comment that we need to go and look beyond the text, that's also, I think, a very conservative idea. We have in Talmudic text, Pukhazi, right? Go see what the people are doing. And often when you go see what the people are doing, that does have an impact on the decisions that we make about halacha. And I think that I would call them the agadot of contemporary life, or the agadot of history, these stories and experiences very much have to be part of this conversation with Torah broadly defined, just as I think they always were. I mean, even internally to the Torah, and certainly once we get to the rabbinic tradition.
Thank you, David. Before I give it to you, I have a feeling that part of what's happening with Caplan and text, and those of you who have expertise in this area, which is pretty much everyone here, can maybe think about it and bring in some questions afterwards. But I have a feeling that part of his approach to Jewish text is motivated by that opening chapter of the meaning of God in modern Jewish religion that's been alluded to already, where in the conference where he defines revaluation and transvaluation. And transvaluation is reading into the text things that were not originally intended in the text, but also were probably completely foreign to what the text is actually saying, even in an implication, versus revaluation, which might be something that the author didn't consciously think about, but is clearly embedded in the text. He feels that the rabbis could do some of the things that they did because they did not put the text in a historical context, and they imagined that all truth was in it, and therefore every positive thing that they read out of it had to be legitimate. Caplan kind of says he doesn't think that that works in our time because we place the text in its context, and we know that Ben Zorer Moreh probably meant exactly that, and therefore we can't do what the rabbis did. All we can do is kind of say, well, they thought this way, but we can't think this way. So I'm just throwing out that to think about, because I think the whole idea how we interpret text is an interesting thing. David?
Let me frame this differently, and that is around the concept of training people to do the right thing. This is central to Caplan. He comes to this over and over again. And to Caplan, there are two indispensable components to that training. The first is the study of Torah and its moral truths. But he recognized that if those truths could not be translated into social efficacy, again, his words, efficacy, over and over again, then they are nothing more than what he explicitly rejects, the Greek idea of study for its own sake, of study being the sunum bonum here, the end in and of itself. For him, it has to be the social efficacy. And the means to get from the study to the social efficacy for him is what he calls law. And now that includes the concept of those mitzvot that work for different communities and different people, but it also is something a bit broader than just the halakha in this sense. Now, in making this argument, he actually stands with the thread of the Jewish tradition that goes from the Rambam, who argued that one of the key purposes of the mitzvot was to train people to do the right thing over and above it being God's command, per se, but that's why God commanded it in part, to train people to do the right thing. You find it in some of the Musar literature, and you find it in medieval texts like Sefer Hasidim here, that gives a rational explanation for why we have many of the laws that we have. He takes this in a modern sense. And I just want to read you to show you the power of this. Just a couple of quotations from Judaism as Civilization. The naivete which enabled the Jew to accept certain writings and traditions as supernatural revelation has departed. Categorical statement from him. If, however, the continuity of Jewish civilization is to be maintained, nothing is so sure to accomplish that end as a habit of study associated with Torah. Torah, as a habit of study, was primary in traditional Judaism, but it was not merely a form of intellectual activity, it was a spiritual experience. The importance of study was paramount because it led to the practice of the right. Torah as study never meant detached contemplation of truth, but group discussion with a view to arriving to a knowledge of the right in specific problems of human conduct. In addition to the usual attributes of national life, what differentiated Judaism from other religious or ethical philosophies is the fact that the primary emphasis is on the translation of ethical theory into legal practice. The only way to learn is by doing. Yet despite courses in ethics and religion, it may not have the least influence upon their character and conduct. The only way to learn is by doing. If Jewish life is to exercise an educative influence upon the character of the Jew, it must possess the instrumentalities of Jewish self-government and the opportunity of lawmaking. The formal distinction between ethics and law or jurisprudence may be stated thus: law is ethics plus the element of social efficacy. By the way, pause button. It's one of the reasons in the New Zionism he makes the argument why the place that the Jew can best fulfill its role of being an Or L'Goyim is in Israel, because the forms of self-government and the ability to enact laws that would implement those ethical standards was stronger there. But back to the central point here. That seems to me to be the frame of everything that my colleagues have talked about, and your question is about what is the role of Torah and social justice. That it is the source of moral truths, but framed in such a way through the prism of law here, that is custom ceremonies, the things that we do that help a community and civilization remain strong in Durkheimian terms, that allows those values to flourish in reality, and that reality is tested by whether or not it actually changes the world.
Thank you. But since we can't, the format doesn't easily lend itself to me having any sense if anybody wants to respond to anything that anybody has said. Please, before we move on, do you have anything you would like to say in response to what you've heard? Either of you, either Jill or Shmuly or... No, you're okay? You're fine. All right, so since I want to make sure that we have time for questions, I want to skip ahead to this question of faith. You've got this quote that you can read as I set up this issue. So here, I think Caplan and Heschel, since we've spoken about them already yesterday a little bit, having them in conversation with each other in fruitful ways, Caplan and Heschel have both a similarity and a difference here. In this wonderful interview with Carl Stern, Heschel tells him that in his theological vision, whatever I do to man, I do to God. When I hurt a human being, I injure God. Unless I feel my life is accountable to him, capitalized, who's much greater than I am, I could not always control my mean leanings. I would not always be ready for self-sacrifice. In other words, that in Heschel's universe, God really, in some way that we can't fully understand, but in a way that is meant to be understood, I think, more than just poetically, but on a higher, like a deeper level than just poetically, suffers when people are suffering. And the belief that God is suffering is something that spurs Heschel, he tells us, on to going and doing the right thing because he doesn't want to let God down. He doesn't want God to be suffering as a result of the fact that he hasn't done what he needs to do. This is Heschel speaking. Now, Caplan doesn't have a theology that allows for that type of statement, right? But as you see here, he thinks that faith is equally as important as Heschel does, but of course he puts it through his own theological universe, and he says that in his theological universe, right, God is the existence of God, i.e., all of the forces in the world together that make for creativity and possibility of self-realization, means that the social activist, in a sense, has these godly forces on their side. And therefore, when they go out to do something, they can count on these forces, in some way, helping them both personally kind of move on and also working with the people who they're trying to convince, etc. And he believes that if you are a secular humanist who doesn't have faith, you are at a tremendous disadvantage in this regard because you don't have this belief that there is some type of movement within the world that supports world betterment. So what I wanted to throw out is, both is to ask you to respond to what Caplan here is saying from his theological standpoint, and to reflect on what the role is of faith, do you believe, in Jewish social justice. When I mean faith, faith in God. What role does, what is its significance in terms of the life of the social activist? What role does faith, if I can be so bold to ask, play in your own lives? And what was your response to Caplan's take on how faith could play out, and on Heschel's take on how faith plays out? And I haven't let David speak first yet, so I'll call on David first.
Yeah, look, I'm at a bit of a disadvantage here. There are major Caplan scholars in the room who would be able to answer this particular question, I think, far better than I can do. Here, this quote, in the way that you're presenting it, Eric, does not correlate with my understanding of Caplan and his view. I would substitute in everything you said, which I agree with, religion for God. I think he believes religion is indispensable as a way to help people get back to a moral center. That good deeds in social justice work in the abstract is like a bouquet of cut flowers that are wither and die, no way to sustain itself. And all of those rituals and ceremonies and customs and engagement with the text that offer the moral guidance of the rabbis over the centuries, all a part for Jews of helping to keep a focus on why that moral command, that ethical command that is so central to him, is imperative to us, and give guidance to how to frame it and present it and transmit it to the next generation. I think all of that is true. I feel that in everything he writes. I don't feel this sense of any way, of God in this sense as some kind of commanding presence to do good or to do ethics. But you asked about me personally, and here I differ with Caplan. I do find that commanding presence, that if the encounter of the divine means anything to me, it is to teach a lesson. And these are words that actually Caplan uses, the first phrase of this, in essence, that we don't exist for existence' sake alone, we Jews. We don't continue, now I'm using my own language, for continuity's sake. But because we are called for a holy purpose, to be God's partners in shaping a better and more hopeful future. That God has given that to us, given us the ability that we don't know anywhere else in creation is found. The ability to understand the difference between right and wrong, to choose between right and wrong, and to be God's partners through the blueprint of our sacred text to create that world of justice and peace. To use Isidore Tversky's name, it is exactly that call to partnership that has raised us above mere biological existence and given to our lives meaning and destiny and purpose. One cannot claim to be a God-intoxicated Jew, Tversky writes, without having a passion for social justice. To me, that speaks to who I am, and it speaks to my understanding of the text and my understanding of a God that is the source, whether voluntarily or not, that has allowed space for humanity to be God's partner in shaping that world of justice and peace. So for me, that commanding presence is there. I do not feel it in Caplan, and I kind of see this quote as kind of a substitute for how he talks about religion more broadly. But again, I step aside to all of you who are experts in this field.
Thank you. Jill?
You've plunged me right into the depth of my many, many year struggle with Caplan that maybe some of the people in the room can help with. But for me, when I read Caplan, I can believe in his theology. It's rational. It makes a lot of sense to me. But that's not the God who I can pray to. So I found, from the very first time I read Caplan, which I don't know, in college or maybe even before, I felt like his God makes complete sense to me, rational, it works in my world, and yet when I wake up in the morning and put on tefillin, I can't pray to the power that makes for salvation. I'm praying to Heschel's God, or to a God that is described in Heschel and other places, a more deeply personal God. So I don't have a resolution for that, but I will say that God absolutely plays a role in my social justice work in a few different ways. One is this impulse that Heschel describes, which comes out through many, many texts that have to do with what Tselem Elohim means, where we have God saying, for example, like, what does the Shekhinah say when a human being is hurt? It's that God is saying, my head is too heavy, my head hurts, my arm hurts. This famous midrash about when a person is hanged, it's as if you had a situation with a king and a twin brother who's a robber, and the twin brother is hanged. where we're seeing ourselves as, in some ways, manifestations or representations of God, that anything that happens to us is directly happening to God. So that very much resonates with me because it makes the work that we're doing so much bigger. Of course, it's horrific. It's cause for deep, deep concern and activism whenever a single human being is hurt. At the same time, it's very easy to just shut that out, to say, 11, 12 people were killed in a suicide bombing in Pakistan. Well, I don't know any of them. I don't know their families. I'm not connected to them. It's very easy for me to just turn the newspaper and not notice. Or people who are being killed in Syria, in Ukraine, and any place else in the world. It's very easy for me to say, well, those aren't my people. I don't know anything about them. It's much harder when I'm living in a context in which I very much believe that the concept of Tselem Elohim means that every single injury to any individual person is also a deep injury to God. So that's one of the places where it shows up for me. Another place, I think you're going to ask us about prayer later, and maybe we'll go more into it, but human rights work, social justice work is frustrating. It's infuriating. It's like one step forward, two steps back. And for me, prayer life is a way of rooting myself and saying, first of all, I can't do this by myself. It has to be in community. Second, to say I'm getting support and strength from my relationship with God. And third, to be reminded that I also just can't step back and look at God and say, all right, you take care of this. That in all of the, even in Birkot HaShachar, when we're saying that God is the one who gives us sight, who lifts up those who are bent down, who provides for all of our needs, I don't read that as saying, all right, well, I'm just going to get out of here. I'm going to be sitting in the Beit Midrash. Call me if you need me. I read that very much as saying, yeah, it's not just about us. We're not going to solve all these problems. We need this bigger fill in the blank, what you call it, whether it's God, the power that makes for salvation, divinity, whatever makes sense. And we need to be in relationship with that power. At the same time, I think that those prayers very much push us back out into the world. So for me, this relationship with God is very much a push-pull to say, as David said so beautifully, we're in partnership. God counts on us to be going out and doing work in the world. It's not for us to just be sitting around praying and hoping that everything feels better. On the other hand, if we divorce ourselves from God and think that we can do it ourselves, first of all, that's incredible hubris, because we can't, we haven't. And we burn out, we fail to enter into community, and I think ultimately we also fail to see how important ultimately our work is, because we just see it in the here and now and don't see it connected to any greater purpose.
Thank you. Of course, as in the quotes that I sent around on prayer, and unfortunately we won't get to them specifically, but some of those functions of prayer that you mentioned, such as the strength that comes from the community and being in community and what you learn from that, are evident in Caplan, but I don't know what he would do with the ideas that we can't rely on ourselves. I think he would fully, I think he ultimately would say that we have to rely on ourselves, counting on the fact that the universe is so constituted to enable us to be able to succeed. But that's different, of course, than I think what you're speaking of. Shmuly.
Well, I'm very struck, as always, by David's and Jill's comments and pondering those quite a bit. Caplan's pragmatism really does speak to me deeply. Perhaps it's a little bit of my postmodern side, that true theology for me is theology that works. It's theology that transforms us to live better in the world. It's the theology that inspires me to speak more kindly to a customer service agent over the phone, even though no one can see me, to pay my domestic worker properly, to properly treat the environment, things that we're not held accountable to in society. But I want to know that my belief in a certain model of God actually helps me to get to that, work towards that utopian type of world. In one of these Caplan quotes, he talks about the belief in the Exodus from Mitzrayim, from Egypt. And he says, that belief should move us to participate in the self-emancipation of the Jewish people and of all peoples that are victims of discrimination and oppression. They become matter for Jewish religious education. And in many ways, my notion of belief is similar. Rabbi David Hartman had a nice point where he said, what does it mean to believe in Yetziat Mitzrayim, to believe in that we left Egypt? It means that you properly handle your weights and measures. You do business ethically, because that's what ultimately the lesson of leaving Egypt was about. And I think I really view theology through that moral lens of what belief is going to help us, help get us there. And for me, two of the pragmatic functions of my belief in God, one is that sense of divine partnership we've been talking about. And the other is that it inspires humility, that we don't see the full picture, that there's a level of accountability. And I see very much the first notion in the passages we've read, this notion of divine partnership, of being a part of a cosmos of progress to some degree that we're partnering with. And I agree with my colleagues that for me, the process theology, the liberation theology of the crying God, of the God hand in hand, that breaks from the Maimonidean track, from Spinoza in a lot of ways, really gets me there further than Caplan gets me there. But I do also, it very much resonates, breaking from this notion of a supernatural divine who is going to intervene, raises the stakes. It raises the accountability that I feel. Just to touch on the prayer aspect, because this is deeply interconnected, of does this belief actually work for me? Three of Caplan's points here deeply resonate for me. Firstly, that prayer should evoke certain emotions that can carry over into our service in the world. Second, that it should awaken our conscience. It should awaken a part of our soul and mind and heart to a greater sense of achievement. And thirdly, that we build a community and more broadly a civilization around these shared values, and prayer helps to reinforce that. You know, those values really speak to me. And again, as a pluralist, I think we need a lot of theologies in the community, and I feel grateful that Caplan's exists, even if it doesn't always get me where I want to go. But on many levels, it does add to what I want to do. And I think that rather than being situated as an absolute believer in one theology, I prefer pragmatically to dance between theologies. And I think I like to have a couple toes in Caplan theology from time to time.
Thank you. I'm going to put up a quote here. We've got a kind of I guess it's in a different place. Here. I'm going to put this up for you to look at. It's the quote on Sukkot that I sent you. Because before taking the questions that have come up, to kind of sum things up, I want to throw out a couple of questions and see if anybody here on the panel has any thoughts about them. One, when I first started to think about Judaism and social justice, Jenny Rosen of the Cummings Foundation organized a trip for me to New York, where I got to meet with a number of people, one of whom was Rabbi Jill Jacobs, when she was still working for Jewish Funds for Justice. And in that context of this trip that I took about 7 or 8 years ago, I had a meeting with Rachel Cowan. And Rachel told me that she feels that the majority of people who are doing social justice work tend not to read the major Jewish social justice thinkers, that they have their own sense of what the connection is between Judaism and social justice, and therefore they're not reading intensely Caplan or necessarily or Heschel or Art Waskow or Michael Lerner, or going back to prophetic Judaism within the Reform tradition of the 1950s, and of course the Bundists and beyond that. So I don't know if that's correct or not, but it got me thinking quite a lot. And I've been reflecting upon that as we think about this particular session. In other words, we're calling this conference that Caplan is the architect of the Jewish future. So, or can be one of the architects, to echo Shmuly's pluralist statement and assertion. So what I want to know is, what in all of the material that you encountered here, or perhaps already were familiar with in Caplan, do you think are ideas and ways of approaching things that you believe would be very enriching to contemporary social justice thinking? And what could we be doing, frankly, as a Caplan Center to get the message out on those things which you as panelists who've encountered the material did find meaningful? What can we do to get Caplan more discussed within social justice circles and more inspirational, perhaps, for wonderful people such as yourselves who are out there doing such important work? Shmuly, maybe you could start us off.
Right. Well, this is something I struggle a lot with. What you just touched upon. You know, I'm going from here out to visit some undocumented immigrants who are on hunger strike right now, and I have trouble getting Jews to actually see the relevance of these individuals on their 14th day of a hunger strike because their relatives are being deported as relevant to our Jewish learning, as if the Egypt story didn't speak to it, as if our immigration, our wandering throughout 2,000 years didn't speak to it, as if our immigration to the U.S. within the last 100 years didn't speak to it. And I'm finding that we need a richer discourse that's theologically driven, that's text rooted for me. And I think we have a challenge to get there. And I want to explore more reading groups and study groups. I mean, a lot of us are a part of this educational process, and I hope the academic community can actually partner with the social justice community to help us strengthen our own rigor in how we're doing this study, because I think that I think there's a lot to learn from one another. You know, Susan Nyman at Princeton wrote a book called Moral Clarity recently, and she deals a little bit there with how many involved in this conversation have dismissed the language of moral clarity and of absolutes that we need to be promoting in society, because we're more afraid of being duped. As skeptics, we're more afraid of being duped by those in power than actually using a voice of power. And I think that those voices of the prophets need to be resurrected, and to use that language of clarity. And also it can be countered by the voice of the Talmud of sort of the humble debating of uncertainty. I think the prophetic and Talmudic tradition can both be kind of resurrected to inspire and create productive discomfort around these issues we're trying to surface. One of the ways Caplan I find helpful, not to me, but to perhaps for others, for me also, is thinking about the holidays as vehicles for social justice. As you mentioned here with Sukkot, and he also writes about Rosh Hashanah, and thinking of the notion of divine majesty as something we need to emulate and be a part of to create sort of the just society. And I think that, those of us in building Jewish communities think a lot about getting people there. We think a lot about our speeches. We think a lot about it being a pleasant experience. But how do we really raise the bar and say, actually, the main time that Jews are coming out, Purim in 1 week, right? Pesach in just about a month, right? That these are actually the measure of success is, what does this lead to? What's the follow-up from this holiday that is going to affect climate change? It's going to affect immigration and worker justice, right? How does this help us get there? And I think that Caplan was really planting those seeds.
David?
I think I've touched on the ones that are most meaningful, that I think have the greatest power to us. That if we're going to play our role as an Uri L'Tzedek, and I would point out parenthetically, the term Uri L'Tzedek doesn't appear in the Bible. In the Bible, it's Or Goyim. So we are a light to and of the nations, which we're part of, including our own country here. So I think you have to transform people, you have to transform your own community and your own institutions, and you have to transform the world. And all three of those are connected. Lose any one of them, and we don't fulfill our destiny as Jews. And then secondly, the idea of Torah, of study, of probing the lessons of our tradition writ large, of law, of structuring ways through our rituals, through our customs, through our practices, to reinforce this generation to generation, reinforce it in our own lives, and measuring what all of that leads to by the social efficacy is a powerful message for us today. And I think also his belief in Israel, which is yet, in Zionism, which is yet still to be fulfilled, that is a place we can best go about. Because we have autonomy and can create our own structures and law in a different sense, that we can truly be an Or L'Goyim is a promise that we have yet to fulfill. If I take issue with anything in Caplan's writings on social justice, it's on the issue of rights versus responsibilities. He talks a lot about human rights and rights that people have, but traditionally, Judaism is a system of responsibility. There is no term for rights in classical Hebrew. The closest you have is zechut, which is something different here. So, but in the difference is passivity, that is, you can remain passive and not do anything to somebody in need, as opposed to affirmative action, acting affirmatively to help people who are in need. The Jewish system of responsibilities, which I think he wants to see, he just doesn't use that terminology. He thinks it's a consequence of respecting rights. But I think we actually lose something by not lifting up the Jewish sense of responsibility that we have to each other, to society at large, to our own community, and to our own families. And that's something that needs to be recaptured now. He calls for that kind of affirmative steps that people take in protecting the rights of others, but I would frame it in a traditional Jewish framework in a way that he doesn't.
Jill, you get the last word. What are parts of Caplan that you found generally meaningful, and what could the Caplan Center be doing to help get these ideas out into the social justice circles?
Sure. Oh, a lot of really good questions. I don't know if we'll answer them all, but I'd say that to go back to your question about why doesn't anybody know about these texts, I'll say that when I first started thinking about Judaism and social justice, which was really about my first year at JTS. Before that, I'd done Judaism, I'd done social justice. I didn't know they came together. I certainly had a sense that nobody else was talking about this. This was 1998. And it took a while before I found Heschel. I mean, I knew about Heschel, but I didn't really get deep into his writings until sometime while I was in rabbinical school, other modern thinkers, as well as the rabbinic tradition, as well as very contemporary thinkers, David being one of them who's been in this work and been a real leader in this work, who it took me a while before I got to read some of what he had written and got to know him. And maybe some of that is natural. Maybe every generation just needs to recreate it on its own. I also think that it's crucially important that those of us who are doing this work are bringing out some of these voices of our tradition and saying, look, this isn't a movement that's 5, 10, 20, 100 years old. This is something that's deeply rooted in our tradition. So I wanted to mention a few, just really 3 ideas that I saw from the text that you gave us that were important that we haven't talked about yet. Or actually, before that, I'll say that I agree with David about rights and responsibilities. I very much see these as 2 sides of a coin. That there are, of course, human rights in our contemporary world. We also know that having human rights doesn't get you very far unless somebody has a responsibility to make sure that you have that right. And I think that's where the idea of chiyuv comes in, to say it's not enough to say, yeah, of course people have the right to food or the right to housing, but that we as individuals and a society have the obligation to make sure that people have access to those rights. So I do think that that's something that Judaism adds. So the 3 things I want to mention, the first is this idea of he says, the great danger facing lovers of peace today lies in the illusion that peace can be attained without law. And he goes on to talk about the UN and the ability of the UN to enforce law. And I think that's really crucially important. When I work for a human rights organization, TRUA brings human rights, and specifically the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, into our Jewish and rabbinic work. And I often get asked the question of, well, what's Jewish about that? What's Jewish about human rights? And one of the answers, not the only answer, but one of the answers is that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a direct response to the Holocaust, was written in part by Jews as well as by many, many other statespeople, and was a way of the world saying, well, what laws can we get into place to make sure that this doesn't happen again? And I think that's critically important, certainly in Israel, that we need the rule of law to ensure that we can come up with a peaceful solution. And it's also deep in halakha, that it's not enough to say, yeah, we have all these ethical principles, that's really nice. We also need the laws of putting these into practice. It's a concept that I learned actually not from Heschel, but from Max Kadushin, who talks about value concepts, about halakha is taking values, ethics, and concretizing them into specific laws. And that's crucial, certainly, to my work. The second quote, this is from one of the chapters of The Future of the American Jew. The line is that a Jewish code of ethical conduct should act as a brake on the insatiable hunger for power. And then he goes on and explains that a little bit more. And this is what's really countercultural about Judaism, is that Judaism doesn't say, well, we're not allowed to own anything. It's not an ascetic tradition, but it also says, you know what, your own power and your own success and your own ego are not what it's all about. That so many of our laws, especially those forcing us into relationships and community, are pushing back at that power. And so I think that's crucial in how we do social justice work. It's certainly a temptation and a pitfall of those who are activists and out there in the world and have prominent roles to say, oh, it's all about me, it's all about me. And I think that our Jewish tradition says, no, it's not about you. It's about God, it's about the community, it's about the future of the world, of Jewish people. And that's certainly a countercultural influence. And the last point that I want to mention is that he also, in The Future of the American Jew, he has a whole section about the practicalities of Jews doing social justice, specifically the reason that Jews doing social justice in the world is good for the Jews in the most practical sense. So I just want to read this, or I'll read a piece of it. He says, wherever there is social injustice or international, interreligious, interracial, or interclass conflict, the distribution of the Jews as a small minority among a large Gentile population jeopardizes their safety, etc. Only when a just social order prevails throughout the world can the Jewish people find peace and Jewish civilization thrive. Okay, so he talks a little more about that. But that for me is really, really crucial, in that a question that I get asked a lot is, oh, so do you work on Jewish issues? People say that to me all the time. Great, you're working on issues in Israel around African asylum seekers, around Palestinians in the occupied territories. You're working on human trafficking and modern day slavery in the agricultural fields in the US, but do you work on Jewish issues? And one of my answers is always, these are Jewish issues, for certainly because they're rooted in Jewish tradition, and I can give all of those halachic, ethical, historical reasons, but also one of the answers is that ultimately this is also about the Jewish community, that if we decide to pull ourselves out of society, just look internally, or just ally ourselves with power, we know from Jewish history how that ends. It doesn't end well for us. And our natural allies are the people who are also struggling, who are also oppressed, and when we partner with those groups of people, and when we work to make sure that nobody's oppressed in our society, it also turns out well for us, because that's who's going to stand with us when all the power structures don't. And so that is, I think, incredibly critical. It feels so relevant today, certainly when we're talking about Israel, certainly when we're talking about anti-Semitism, whether it's in Ukraine or other places, that it's Jewish alliances with the other people who are likely to suffer that's ultimately going to make sure that we have a just world for all of us, including ourselves. We can't pull ourselves out. I mean, we're leading up to Purim, right? I mean, this is the classic moment of Purim. You don't think that it's gonna end up being so great for you, Esther, and not for everybody else. So that's, I think, a very, very central and very practical teaching that we need to bring to Jewish social justice work today.
Thank you. And if you could stay on the line, because we have a couple of questions, which my colleague Dan Cederbaum will read out, and then we'll wrap things up.
Thank you, Eric. That was wonderful. I apologize. There are a lot of good questions, but time is short, so I'm going to try to do this efficiently and compress several. Interestingly, the most popular topic is that of Shemitah. And there are people are asking about various questions, all having to do with the relevance of the concept in the release year coming up in the modern context. Maybe we should take a step back and distinguish between Shmitat Karkaot, the release of the land, and Shmitat Mamon, the release of debt. Of course, there is Hillel's very famous Takana, which exempts pledges to the Caplan Center from the Shemitah year. But apart from that, sorry. So anybody who would like to reflect on what do we do about Shemitah, presumably in this room, at least basically outside of Eretz Yisrael, but maybe within as well.
Well, just as a starting place, I think that starting to reframe Shabbat and Shemitah as concepts of worker justice. You cannot work your worker that day. As concepts of animal welfare. You can't work your animal. Of environmental justice, of not working the land. I think that making this move invites a whole new population into the conversation and makes this idea and this observance a much more transformative vehicle. That's something I'm very interested in pursuing, and I think Shemitah is an immense opportunity we have in the coming year to really be doing some reframing. It's not, actually going back to the traditional roots, I would suggest, of what this is really all about. For me, I happen to be most interested in the debt relief issue. I think there's a lot of people struggling in poverty around medical debt and student debt and house debt. And I think we haven't really opened that up as a religious or a Jewish cultural conversation. And I think the wisdom has a lot to share on how we can address that. Again, for me, it comes from a lot of the nitty gritty of halakha, of how has for 2,000 years this kind of been thought about in abstract and how, but again, reapplying it through a trans-evaluation process, applying it in a very different type of world today.
Any other thoughts? Next question. The questioner writes, I think Caplan would approve the reconstructed notion of the ethical hechsher for Rabbi Yanklowitz. How do you feel about the reconstruction of halakha in this instance? I think you may have touched on it earlier, but if you want to say.
Well, I don't view it as a reconstruction of halakha. I view it as, Tamar Ross has this great book responding to Rav Kook called Expanding the Palace of Torah. And I believe that that Judaism must evolve, but it evolves, it becomes greater. It doesn't just drop one thing and pick up one thing. I think it starts to incorporate a vaster network of ideas. And I think that for centuries, we have embraced kashrut as a ritual concept and avoided a lot of the ethical underpinnings. For me, that's primarily about the worker. But again, it's also deeply about the environment and the trade aspects and the worker. And in this regard, I think that we've spent millions and millions on the hashgacha, on the ritual supervision in the process. And where's the ethical hashgacha of the supervision that people aren't being paid $2 or $3 an hour? It's a real problem. So again, I view this as returning to the tradition about what kashrut was about, not sort of a reconstruction, but I acknowledge that others find meaning in viewing it as a reconstruction, and I want to honor that for those who don't find so much meaning in the ritual aspect, but primarily find it in the ethical aspect. I think that's as much of what kashrut is about.
And for Rabbi Jacobs, a variant on the question, how would you feel about a statement that the ethical hechsher has greater weight and may indeed be the only imperative hechsher today?
That it would be the only imperative hechsher. I don't see that as an either-or question. I want to go to not directly the ethical hechsher, but to another issue that I've worked more closely on, I guess about, it was in 2003, a long time ago, when I first came to the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, the Conservative Movement's law committee, with a tshuva about living wage and unions, saying that Jews and Jewish institutions have an obligation to pay living wage and to hire union workers when it's possible. There was a whole conversation within the committee about whether they could even take up this tshuva, the law committee generally deals with things like, can you add an eighth aliyah if you have a bar mitzvah? Can you use musical instruments on Shabbat? Ritual matters, which I also think are important. I mean, I live according to a fairly traditional halachic life, and they hadn't taken up almost any civil law cases at this point. And there was a very interesting conversation about, well, is this under the purview of halakha? And I have to say that I actually found the conversation a little bit mystifying, because I felt like, well, wait a second, we have this whole section of halakha, it's called Choshen Mishpat, and it's not less part of halakha than Orach Chaim or Yardea, and yet somehow we have inherited this idea that the ritual aspects of halakha are somehow more important. Now, for me, it's not necessarily a part of kashrut. There's a whole area of Jewish law that has to do with worker justice, and that's its own area of law. And it's, as I said, no less important than anything else in Jewish law. Maybe because of various historical reasons, we didn't have a country where we could actually implement laws. It wasn't something that was developed and practiced and certified, but it's an area of law. But I don't think that it's this either or proposition, that either we pay our workers enough, either we eat in restaurants where the restaurants are following Jewish law or civil law. I know that the ethical hechsher, the Tava Yosher that Shmuly's organization has worked on is mostly concerned with federal and state standards. So it's not either that or the food is prepared in a facility where somebody's checked to make sure that no non-kosher products have gone into it. And for me, both of those are essentially important. They both are manifestations of following halakha. They're both ways that brings mindfulness to the food that I'm eating for me. And so I don't want to decide. I don't think I have to decide.
You wanted to add?
Let me just make one other point that links what we just heard with the question that Eric asked before about what does Caplan have to say to us today. His writings on economic justice issues are truly powerful. They are deep, they are structural, they call for profound changes. He challenges us by, we're a poor people in our community, in our synagogues, in our communal institutions. It is not just morally wrong that they're not there, but we close ourselves off by not confronting them to the kind of heightened sensitivity of conscience that we would have if we had to deal with the fact there are poor people amongst us who we bring into fully and integrate into our community. He sees enormous problems with the capitalist system as it existed then, with the comfort level that people of wealth had. He called for radical changes. He said this won't be evolutionary, it'll be revolutionary. The only question is whether it'll be violent revolution or nonviolent or peaceful revolution. I think keeping in mind, although he doesn't cite it, the admonition of the Talmud that the sword enters the world because of justice delayed and justice denied. This writing challenges us today because I think he'd be stunned at the comfort level and the kind of willingness to close our eyes within our own community and in the broader community. I mean, we've had poverty rates that are up 50% in the last 12 years in this country. How is that possible? 60% for the very poor, half the poverty line since the year 2000. How is that possible? Children, and one of the highest in the rates of trial poverty in the richest country in the history of the world. How is that possible? He would be astonished by that, and so should we.
Last question, and then our chair is going to close the panel. It's a big one, but we'll take a moment with it. That's an important one. A problem with faith and social justice. Every faith community, including our own, can believe, to use Bob Dylan's famous formulation, that they have God on their side. So it is an issue for all of you. Anybody want to? I know it's probably not fair, but what do we do with the danger of perhaps putting too much emphasis on religious faith in this world?
I can start. I think the one thing that's crucial is not believing that God is only on our side. And so there are people who bring faith into the public square in ways that make me furious, mostly having to do with social issues whether it's about LGBT rights, whether it's about reproductive rights. We all know the issues where faith is usually talked about. And so that does make me furious. I also recognize that those groups have just as much right to bring their faith into the public square as I do. And in some cases, I want to learn from them. I might absolutely disagree with the way that their faith is showing up in the public square, but I also often will appreciate the questions that come up. I think about around reproductive rights, that I do think that it's difficult territory, and our answers, our personal answers, our answers within our own faith communities might be different from the legislative policy answers. And I think it's important to hear the different perspectives. I also think it's important to say that we don't have, even within all of our faith communities, we don't have all of the answers. And so it's important that we're bringing in social science, the experiences of real people, ethical traditions, and everything else that we have to bring into the public space. So often people will say to me, well, look, if you want to bring Judaism into the public sphere, then it's going to be a numbers game, and the Christian fundamentalists are just going to close you down. And I don't see it like that. I think that everybody's bringing their faith into the public sphere. Some of us are saying it explicitly and some are not. But what we actually need is more voices and more conversation, rather than us saying we're going to shut out our own opinion because we don't want to hear from everybody else.
We just have a minute left.
Shmuly?
Do you want to add?
David, do you want to go?
No, I'm going to pass. And forgive me, I have to give a speech at 2 o'clock down at the convention center. I'm going to need to excuse myself, so I apologize to my colleagues here for running off.
So,
Thank you, David.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, that's just for David, who's leaving. But Shmuly, please
Okay,
continue.
sure. Yeah, so I think what Rabbi Jacob said really spoke to me. That I actually think God is on my side. I'm a little bit guilty, but as I said, for the third time, I really am an epistemic pluralist, and I think that God is on a lot of people's sides in a lot of ways. But also, what it means to be on my side is that it doesn't inspire absolutism. It also inspires a humility. To be on my side means that actually I have a higher level of accountability and a more daunting presence to respond to. And so I think that I want to promote that value as much as I can as well. Similarly, I think that it's very valid to be motivated by religious values in the public sphere. But today we have to use reason and we have to use logic in the marketplace of ideas. And I think we need to continue to learn, for me, how to translate a value of Shemitah into something that passes in a sphere of separation of church and state, but not a separation of faith from the human condition, as Heschel famously says. And so I think we thought this problem was going to go away, but faith is growing globally, and it's radicalizing. And I just sort of urge those who are more moderate or to the left of moderate in their theologies or faith commitments to not abandon the conversation, because we need those voices in here as well.
Thank you. There's an interpretive version of the Yotzer in Caplan's 1945 prayer book, where he's talking about nature, and he's reflecting on the fact that nature also can be frightening. It can send a storm in the middle of your conference. And then he says, however, the more we probe it, we realize that God has also given us the intelligence to work around it. God has given us Skype, which helps us to counter our snowstorms. So, but in a more serious vein, I know that I think I speak for everyone here when I say that I'm deeply, deeply appreciative not only of the effort that you took to connect with us today, but the really serious and deep way in which you have connected with the Caplan texts and reflected upon them, both to have things that you embraced in them and things that you are critical of them. And I hope that we can continue this conversation onwards. And once again, I thought this was fascinating, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.